The smell hits the American surgeon before he even unwraps the bandage. It is not just blood or sweat. It is the sweet, rotten stench of infection, the kind that tells a trained nose that tissue is dying underneath. The German prisoner of war sitting on the examination table does not flinch when the doctor approaches. His face is stone. His jaw is locked, but his left thigh, wrapped in a filthy field dressing that has not been changed in weeks, tells a different story. The surgeon peels back the first layer of cloth. The fabric sticks to the skin like it has been glued there with dried fluid. The prisoner finally speaks in broken English. "It is fine, just shrapnel, small pieces." The surgeon does not answer. He cuts away the rest of the bandage with scissors, and what he sees underneath makes even the nurse step back. The infection has turned the entry wound into a crater. The shrapnel went in just above the knee, tearing through muscle and lodging deep near the femur. That was weeks ago. Somewhere in France, during the final Allied push in early 1945, the German soldier, a 22-year-old machine gunner named Klaus Zimmermann, was hit during an artillery barrage while his unit tried to hold a collapsing defensive line. He did not go down immediately. The adrenaline kept him moving long enough to retreat with what was left of his squad. When the pain finally registered, he was already a mile behind the front, sitting in a ditch with 3 other wounded men and no medic in sight. Klaus treated the wound himself. He poured alcohol from a canteen over the entry hole, packed it with a strip of torn undershirt, and wrapped it tight with whatever cloth he could find. It bled through in minutes, but he told himself it would hold. The shrapnel fragments were still inside, grinding against bone every time he moved. But there was no time to dig them out, and no tools to do it safely. He had seen other men try. Most of them made the bleeding worse, or introduced dirt into the wound, or passed out from the pain and never woke up. So Klaus left the metal where it was, tightened the bandage, and kept walking. That decision kept him alive for 3 more days. It also started a clock that no one could see. Infection does not announce itself all at once. It creeps in. The wound site gets warm to the touch. The skin around the edges turns red, then purple, then a mottled gray that looks like meat starting to spoil. Klaus noticed the heat first, then the smell, then the way his legs started to stiffen. No matter how much he stretched it, by the time American forces overran his position and took him prisoner, the infection had spread into the surrounding muscle tissue. The shrapnel was still there, pushing bacteria deeper with every step he took. He did not tell the Americans. He did not trust them. And in his mind, showing weakness to the enemy was worse than dying quietly. We are now in the first days after Klaus was captured. Moving through the American transport system from the front lines to a holding facility, this is where most prisoners either get immediate care or slip through the cracks for days. Klaus was captured on April 9, 1945, in a farmhouse outside a French village whose name he never learned. American infantry had surrounded the building at dawn. There was no firefight. The 6 Germans inside had no ammunition left, no food, and no orders. They walked out with their hands up and were searched, tagged, and lined up in a dirt courtyard, while officers decided what to do with them. Klaus stood in that line for 2 hours with his weight on his good leg, trying not to limp. If the Americans saw he was wounded, they might separate him from the others. He had heard stories about wounded prisoners being taken away and never seen again. The stories were mostly propaganda, but Klaus believed them. So he stood still, kept his face blank, and did not let the pain show. The Americans loaded the prisoners into the back of a truck and drove them to a temporary holding area, 15 miles behind the lines. It was a fenced field with rows of tents, a processing station, and a makeshift clinic staffed by a single medic who was overwhelmed before the day even started. Klaus passed through the intake line without incident. The American soldier, checking names and numbers, barely looked at him. No one asked if he was injured. The medic was triaging gunshot wounds and amputations, not looking for hidden infections under dirty uniforms. Klaus was assigned to a tent, given a canteen of water and a piece of bread, and told to wait for transport to a permanent camp. He sat on the ground with 40 other men, pulled his jacket tight around his shoulders, and felt the fever start to build. 3 days later, Klaus was loaded onto another truck and moved again. This time the destination was a prisoner of war camp in eastern France. former German barracks that the Allies had converted into a processing center for captured enemy soldiers. The ride took 8 hours. The road was torn apart by tank treads and shell craters, so the truck bounced violently over every rut and hole. Each jolt sent a spike of pain through Klaus's thigh. He bit down on his sleeve to keep from crying out. By the time they arrived, the bandage was soaked through with fluid that was no longer just blood. It was yellowish, thick, and it smelled like something had died. But still, Klaus said nothing. We are now inside the prisoner of war camp, where Klaus has been for nearly a week, and the infection is reaching a critical stage. This is the moment when silence stops being disciplined and starts being a death sentence. The camp doctor, Captain William Holland, was a surgeon from Pennsylvania who had been assigned to prisoner medical duty after spending 18 months in field hospitals patching up American soldiers. He did not ask for this job. Most doctors did not. Treating enemy prisoners meant long hours, limited supplies, and patients who either refused to cooperate or were too broken to care. But Holland took the work seriously. Every morning he walked through the barracks looking for men who were trying to hide illness. He checked for labored breathing, for the subtle signs that someone was deteriorating fast. On his 6th morning at the camp, he noticed Klaus. Klaus was sitting on his bunk with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out in front of him. His face was gray. His eyes were glassy. His left pant leg was stained with a dark, wet patch that had spread from the thigh down to the knee. Holland stopped walking. He approached the bunk and spoke in slow, clear English. "Stand up." Klaus did not move. Holland repeated the command louder this time and gestured for Klaus to get to his feet. Klaus tried. He planted his good leg, pushed himself upright, and immediately collapsed back onto the bunk. His left leg would not support any weight. Holland crouched down, reached for the stained fabric, and pressed 2 fingers against the thigh, just above the knee. Klaus went rigid. Holland pulled his hand back and saw the damp residue on his fingertips. He did not need to smell it to know what it was. Holland ordered 2 guards to carry Klaus to the medical tent. Klaus protested in German, insisting he could walk, but his body had already made the decision for him. The guards lifted him under the arms and dragged him across the compound while other prisoners watched in silence. Inside the tent, Holland laid Klaus on an examination table, cut away the pant leg with scissors, and began unwrapping the bandage. The cloth came off in layers, each one more soaked and discolored than the last. When the final strip peeled away, the wound was fully exposed. The skin around the entry site had turned black at the edges. The crater itself was filled with a mixture of pus, dead tissue, and fragments of embedded shrapnel that glinted under the tent's overhead light. Holland looked at Klaus and said 3 words that made the young German's face finally crack. "Your wound is infected." We are still in the medical tent, and Captain Holland is now faced with a choice that will determine whether Klaus Zimmermann lives or dies in the next 72 hours. Holland knew that the infection had already spread beyond the wound site. The blackened tissue, the fever, the inability to bear weight, all of it pointed to deep tissue, necrosis, and possible sepsis. If the shrapnel stayed in, the infection would continue to advance. If it reached the bloodstream, Klaus would be dead within days. The only option was debridement, the surgical removal of dead tissue and foreign objects, followed by aggressive drainage and antibiotic treatment. The problem was that Holland had no anesthesia. The camp's medical supplies were limited to sulfa powder, bandages, and a few vials of morphine reserved for amputations. Cleaning out a wound this deep without putting the patient under meant inflicting pain that most men could not endure. Holland had done it before on American soldiers who had no other choice, but those men trusted him. Klaus did not. Holland called for his nurse, a corporal named Stevens, who had assisted in dozens of field surgeries. He explained the procedure in technical terms, then switched to plain language. "We are going to clean it out. All of it. If he fights us, we will have to hold him down." Stevens nodded and began preparing the instruments. A set of forceps, a scalpel, irrigation solution, and a basin for the extracted debris. Holland turned to Klaus, who was still on the table, breathing fast and staring at the ceiling. "I am going to remove the shrapnel and clean the wound," Holland said slowly. "It will hurt, but if I do not do this, you will die."
Klaus
Did not respond. His hands were gripping the edges of the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. Holland gave Klaus a half dose of morphine, just enough to take the edge off without knocking him unconscious. Then he positioned a lamp directly over the wound, pulled on a pair of gloves, and picked up the forceps. The first piece of shrapnel came out easily, a jagged shard of steel about the size of a thumbnail that had been sitting just under the skin. Klaus flinched, but did not cry out. The second piece was deeper, buried in the muscle near the femur. Holland had to probe with the forceps, feeling for the metal, then grip it firmly and pull straight up. This Timaloose screamed. It was a short, strangled sound that he cut off by biting down on a rolled piece of cloth Stevens had placed in his mouth. Holland did not stop. He extracted 2 more fragments, each one coated in pus and dead tissue, and dropped them into the basin with a metallic clink. We are still in the operating tent, and Klaus Zimmermann, who has not cried in front of another person since he was a child, is about to reach his limit. Holland moved from extraction to debridement. Using the scalpel, he began cutting away the necrotic tissue, the black and gray sections that were too far gone to heal. Each cut released more fluid, more of that sickly sweet smell that filled the tent and made Stevens turn his head to breathe. Klaus was shaking now. The morphine had worn down to almost nothing, and every slice felt like fire running through his leg. He tried to stay still. He tried to keep his breathing steady. But when Holland irrigated the wound with saline solution, flushing out the remaining debris and exposing raw nerve endings to open air, Klaus broke. The sob came first, a single choking sound that he could not hold back. Then his whole body convulsed, and the tears started. Holland paused. He set down the scalpel and looked at Klaus's face. The young German was crying openly now, his chest heaving, his hands still locked on the table but trembling. "I know," Holland said quietly. "I know it hurts." Klaus did not understand all the English words, but he understood the tone. It was not pity. It was not contempt. It was the voice of someone who had seen this before, and knew that pain had a breaking point that had nothing to do with courage. Holland placed one hand on Klaus's shoulder, a brief firm pressure, then went back to work. He packed the wound with sulfa powder, covered it with clean gauze, and wrapped the entire thigh in a tight bandage that would hold everything in place while the body tried to heal itself. When it was over, Holland helped Klaus sit up. The young German was still crying, but quietly now. It's a kind of exhausted tears that come after the body has used up everything it had. Stevens brought a canteen of water, and Klaus drank it in for long swallows. Holland spoke again, slower this time. "You will stay here for observation. We will change the bandage every day. If the fever breaks, you will survive." Klaus nodded. He did not say thank you. He did not know how. But when Holland turned to leave, Klaus reached out and grabbed the doctor's wrist. The grip was weak, but it lasted just long enough to say what words could not. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? We would love to know who is keeping these stories alive. Klaus's story is not unique, but it is a reminder that medicine in war does not stop at the front lines. We are now 3 weeks into Klaus's recovery, and the question is no longer whether he will survive, but what survival means when the war is almost over. The fever broke on the 2nd day. Holland had expected it to take longer, but Klaus's body, ravaged as it was, still had enough fight left to push back against the infection once the source was removed. The wound itself took longer to stabilize. For the first week, Holland changed the bandage twice a day, checking for signs of reinfection. Each time, the cavity looked a little less angry, a little more pink around the edges where new tissue was trying to form. By the end of the 2nd week, Klaus could stand without help. By the 3rd, he could walk short distances with a limp that would probably never fully go away. Klaus did not speak much during his recovery. He followed orders, took his medication, and sat quietly on his bunk when he was not being examined. But something had shifted. Other prisoners noticed it. The stone-faced defiance was gone, replaced by something softer, something that looked almost like relief. One of the other German prisoners, an older man named Ernst, who had been captured at the same time, asked Klaus what the American doctor had said during the surgery. Klaus thought about it for a long time before answering. He said, "I would die if he did not help me." Then he helped me. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. Klaus's case was one of thousands, but it represents a larger truth about how medical care for prisoners of war varied wildly depending on who held them and where. We are stepping back now to look at the broader picture of prisoner medical treatment during World War II, because Klaus's survival was not guaranteed by policy, was determined by circumstance. By the end of the war, the United States held approximately 378,000 German prisoners of war on American soil and in camps across Europe. Not all of them received the same level of care. Camps closer to the front lines, like the one where Klaus was held, often had better access to trained surgeons and medical supplies because they were part of the active military supply chain. Camps farther from combat zones, especially those in remote areas, sometimes went weeks without seeing a doctor. Infection rates among wounded prisoners varied depending on how quickly they were processed after capture. Studies conducted after the war estimated that untreated shrapnel wounds had a mortality rate of around 30% if left for more than 10 days. Klaus had been carrying his infection for nearly 3 weeks. The German military's own treatment of prisoners was far less consistent. Soviet prisoners of war in German camps faced mortality rates as high as 57%, many of them dying from starvation, disease, or deliberate neglect. Western Allied prisoners fared better, but medical care was still inconsistent. In some camps, wounded prisoners received surgery and antibiotics. In others, they were left to recover or die on their own. The Geneva Convention technically required captors to provide medical care equivalent to what they gave their own soldiers. But enforcement was impossible in the chaos of total war. Klaus was lucky. He was captured by Americans, treated by a skilled surgeon, and held in a camp with access to sulfur drugs. Change any one of those variables and he would have died. The shrapnel fragments extracted from Klaus's leg were later examined and catalogued. They were pieces of an American artillery shell fired during the barrage that had wounded him in the first place. That detail, documented in Holland's medical notes, added a bitter irony to the case. Klaus had been injured by the same military that later saved his life. Holland never mentioned it to Klaus. There was no reason to. The war did not care about irony. It only cared about who lived and who did not. We are now in late April 1945, and the war in Europe is collapsing so fast that the camp where IAs is recovering will soon stop being a military facility and become a displacement center. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, less than 3 weeks after Klaus's surgery. The news reached the camp in the form of a loudspeaker announcement that most of the German prisoners did not fully believe at first. Some thought it was propaganda. Others thought it was a test to see who would celebrate and who would resist. Klaus, still limping and still sleeping in the medical barracks, felt nothing when he heard it. The war had already ended for him the moment Captain Holland pulled the first piece of shrapnel from his leg. Everything after that was just paperwork. The camp began processing prisoners for repatriation, but the system was overwhelmed. Thousands of German soldiers were waiting to go home, but home no longer existed in any recognizable form. Cities were in ruins. Families were scattered. The occupation zones were still being drawn. Klaus had no idea where his parents were, or if they had survived the Allied bombing campaigns that had leveled much of Western Germany. He wrote a letter to his mother's last known address in Cologne, but he had no expectation that it would reach her. The Red Cross was handling mail for displaced persons, but the backlog was months long. Holland discharged Klaus from medical observation in early June. The wound had closed. Though the scar tissue was thick and uneven, and the muscle damage meant Klaus would never run again. Holland wrote a final note in Klaus's medical file, stating that the prisoner was fit for light work, but should not be subjected to heavy labor or forced marches. That note, a single paragraph in a military file that would eventually be archived and forgotten, may have saved Klaus's life a second time. Prisoners marked as fully recovered were often assigned to labor details, clearing rubble, or repairing infrastructure. Klaus, still officially classified as recovering, was assigned to kitchen duty. He peeled potatoes and washed dishes for 3 months while waiting for his repatriation papers to clear. We are now in September 1945, and Klaus Zimmermann is finally going home. Though the word home no longer means what it used to, Klaus was released from American custody on September 14th and placed on a train. Heading east toward the British occupation zone in Germany, the journey took 2 days. The railroads were still damaged and the trains moved slowly, stopping frequently to let military convoys pass. Klaus shared a compartment with 11 other former prisoners, most of them silent, all of them staring out the windows at a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Entire towns had been reduced to rubble. Bridges were gone. Fields were cratered. The few people visible along the tracks looked like ghosts wandering through the wreckage with nowhere to go. When the train finally stopped at a processing station near Cologne, Klaus stepped onto the platform and felt his leg buckle. He caught himself on a railing and stood there for a moment, breathing hard, waiting for the pain to pass. A British soldier asked if he needed help. Klaus shook his head and kept walking. He had been given a paper with his discharge information, a ration card, and 20 marks. That was all. The British officer at the gate told him that the city center was mostly destroyed, but some neighborhoods on the outskirts were still intact. Klaus thanked him and started walking toward the address he had memorized, the apartment building where his mother had lived before the war. It took him 4 hours to cover 3 miles. His leg would not bend properly, and every few blocks he had to stop and rest. When he finally reached the street, he saw that the entire block had been flattened. There was no building. There were no walls, just piles of brick and twisted metal and a few pieces of furniture that had somehow survived and were now sitting in the open, air like museum exhibits. Klaus stood there until the sun went down. Then he turned around and walked back toward the processing center where displaced persons were being housed in temporary barracks. A clerk gave him a bunk and told him that the Red Cross was maintaining a registry of survivors. Klaus added his name to the list and waited. We are now 6 months after Klaus returned to Germany, and this is where his story intersects with a decision that Captain William Holland made without knowing whether it would matter. Holland had kept a copy of Klaus Zimmermann's medical file. It's not because it was required, but because the case had stayed with him. He had treated hundreds of wounded men, both American and German. But there was something about the young prisoner who had cried on the operating table that he could not forget. In March of 1946, nearly a year after the surgery, Holland wrote a letter. He addressed it to Klaus Zimmermann, care of the Red Cross Displaced Persons Office in Cologne. He did not know if Klaus was alive. He did not know if the letter would reach him, but he wrote it anyway. The letter was short. Holland explained that he had been the surgeon who treated Klaus in the prisoner of war camp in France. He asked if Klaus had made it home, and if the leg had healed properly. He included his address in Pennsylvania and said that if Klaus ever wanted to write back, he would be glad to hear from him. The letter took 2 months to reach Cologne and another 3 weeks to be forwarded to the barracks where Klaus was living. When Klaus finally received it, he read it 4 times before he understood what it meant. An American officer, a man who had every reason to see him as just another enemy casualty, had taken the time to check if he was still alive. Klaus wrote back. His English was poor, so he kept the letter simple. He thanked Holland for saving his life. He explained that he was living in temporary housing and working as a laborer, helping to rebuild the city. He said that the leg still hurt, but he could walk, and that was enough. He signed the letter and mailed it, not knowing if Holland would ever read it. 3 months later, a second letter arrived from Pennsylvania. Holland had received Klaus's reply. He was glad to know that Klaus had survived. He enclosed a photograph of himself in uniform standing outside a hospital tent. On the back, he had written a single sentence. "You were stronger than you thought." We are now in the early 1950s, and Klaus Zimmermann has rebuilt a life. It looks nothing like the one he had before the war. Klaus never found his mother. The Red Cross eventually confirmed that she had died during an air raid in 1944. Months before Klaus was even captured. His father had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. Klaus had no siblings. The war had erased his entire family, leaving him alone in a country that was itself trying to remember how to function. He stayed in Cologne and found work as a carpenter's assistant. The leg limited what he could do, but he learned to adapt. He could not climb ladders or carry heavy loads, but he could measure, cut, and assemble. The work was steady, and it kept him fed. In 1952, Klaus married a woman named Greta, a war widow with a young daughter. They met at a community kitchen where displaced persons gathered for subsidized meals. Greta had lost her first husband in Stalingrad and had been living with her parents until their building was condemned. She and Klaus bonded over the shared experience of having survived something that should have killed them. They did not talk about the war much. Most people did not. It was easier to focus on rebuilding than to dwell on what had been lost. They had a small wedding in a registry office and moved into a 2-room apartment on the edge of the city. Klaus kept Captain Holland's letters in a wooden box under his bed. Over the years, he and Holland exchanged a handful more, updating each other on marriages, children, and work. The letters were never long, and they never dug into the trauma of the war. They were simply two men who had shared a moment of desperate humanity and wanted to remember that it had happened. In 1968, Holland died of a heart attack at the age of 63. His widow sent Klaus a final letter letting him know that her husband had spoken about the German prisoner whose life he had saved and that it had mattered to him. Klaus cried when he read that letter. The same kind of quiet, exhausted tears he had cried on the operating table 23 years earlier. We are ending this story in the present. Looking back at what Klaus Zimmermann's case tells us about war, medicine, and the thin line between enemy and human being. Klaus Zimmermann died in 1994 at the age of 71. The infection that nearly killed him in 1945 never fully left his body. The scar tissue in his thigh developed chronic complications, and he walked with a cane for the last 20 years of his life, but he lived. He raised Greta's daughter as his own. He worked until he retired. He saw Germany reunified. And every year on April 9th, the anniversary of his capture, he wrote a short note in a journal he kept, thanking a doctor he had met for less than an hour, but who had given him 50 more years. Captain William Holland's decision to treat Klaus Zimmermann was not extraordinary by medical standards. It was simply the application of his training and his oath to a patient who needed it. But in the context of war, where dehumanization was the default and compassion was often seen as weakness, it was a radical act. Holland did not treat Klaus because he stopped seeing him as an enemy. He treated him because he never stopped seeing him as a patient. That distinction, small as it seems, is the difference between systems that heal and systems that destroy. The shrapnel fragments extracted from Klaus's leg were never returned to him. They remained in Captain Holland's possession until his death, stored in a small glass vial that his widow later donated to a military medical museum in Pennsylvania. The vial is still there, labeled with Klaus's name, his prisoner number, and the date of the surgery. It sits in a display case alongside instruments, photographs, and records from field hospitals across World War II. Visitors walk past it every day, most of them never stopping to read the card. But the fragments are still there,